his feet, learning from him, hearing his teachings over and over again about serving and about loving. Even though they have been students of Jesus now for a long time, even though that is the case, their own ego was overridden, overrided their spirituality. One's ego can override one's spirituality. To sit at Jesus' right hand and his left hand were positions of incredible power. Now, obviously, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, also nicknamed the sons of thunder because they had bad tempers. Obviously, they still saw Jesus' mission on this earth to be one where he would reestablish Israel as a political and economic power in the region. They still saw Jesus as one who was going to arise as the Messiah to usher in the messianic age of King David and recreate that all over again. So when Jesus became king, they wanted to go ahead and put themselves in positions to be Jesus' right hand and Jesus' left hand men and to rule with Jesus. They saw Jesus' ultimate purpose on this planet to be one of creating a nation state full of power. Now, they asked this question. And every adult in this room, I'm going to look at your expression when I read their question. Jesus, will you grant us whatever we ask you? Have you ever had a child do that? Would you make me a promise? Our response typically is what? Well, tell me what it is first, because we're not going to fall into that trap. But teacher, will you do whatever we ask of you? And lo and behold, Jesus tells them to ask. I find that amazing. There were no parameters. There were no limitations. Yeah, what is it that you want? But I have a sense Jesus already knew. Now, I want to give you a little context of this passage so that you see that what James and John did may not be as presumptuous as what it appears in the Bible story. All right? The first four people that Jesus called to be his disciple were James and John, sons of Zebedee, and Peter and Andrew. They were the first four. So they were with Jesus from the very beginning. So when you're there and a part of a movement from the very beginning, then you have status, right? Maybe over the people who came later. But another thing, too, is whenever Jesus goes to the Mount of Transfiguration, he asks Peter, James, and John to go with him. When he went to the Gethsemane and the other disciples, he asked Peter, James, and John to come with him to pray for him while he was in his hour of greatest need. So there are parts and stories of the Bible where Jesus called Peter, James, and John to join him in some of the most crucial, pivotal times of Jesus' ministry. So the fact that they were a part of all of these events, it's not a huge jump for them to think that, okay, when the time comes, let's make sure that we have our positions of power when Jesus establishes his kingdom. It may have also crossed their mind, too, that Jesus was very close to Peter and Andrew. So maybe they thought, let's jump on this before Peter and Andrew do. What we see in this passage is how one's ego can interfere with trust in the community. Because when the other 10 heard about it, it says they became indignant. We have other words for that you're not allowed to use in church. But you, see, you're laughing, so you already know what I'm talking about. They were very angry. Why were they angry? Did they feel that James and John were trying to butt into something and become something and leaving them all behind? Possibly. Or could it be this, that all of them also thought about doing the same thing, but they didn't leap for it yet, right? Have you ever been angry when you're on the interstate and the traffic is backed up and you see people coming down the emergency lane and then cutting in? Now, most of us are being very obedient in keeping our place in line, right? And it outrages us when we see those people butting in and bypassing all the rest of us. But has it ever crossed your mind to go ahead and try to do the same thing? Yeah, we can't blame them for that. So when they asked Jesus their question, he basically says, you have no clue what it is that you're asking. And so then Jesus does what Jesus always does. He tells them the truth. Okay, are you willing to drink of my cup? Are you willing to be baptized with my baptism? Are you willing to be totally immersed in what I'm immersed in? We can, they answered. But what was Jesus asking them? Are you willing to go through the kind of suffering that Jesus knew he was going to be going through? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to put your life on the line? And are you willing to become so totally immersed in my mission that you're going to risk your lives? Because what Jesus was doing is he was challenging the powers, the religious powers, the political powers, the money powers, the occupation powers of Rome. He was challenging all of them and creating this movement. And the movement that he was creating was one in which God values all human beings. And in God's banquet table, there is a place for all of God's children. And this was not the popular notion of the day. And also, Jesus was not destroying the law, but he was rather helping them to transcend and rise with it and fulfill it. Because what had happened with the religious leaders is in their desire to control, they were made so many rules and regulations that the people could not bear the burden and became more estranged from God because of the rules and regulations than growing closer to God. And then you have the other religious leaders and the power brokers who were becoming very wealthy by working with the Roman occupiers. So here Jesus is coming in, he's threatening every bit of that. And when people who are wealthy and who are in power and they feel like there is a movement threatening them, what do they typically do? Kill the movement. So this is what Jesus is talking about. Are you willing to go there? Are you willing to drink from this cup? Are you willing to be immersed, baptized into this movement? Yeah. Because I'm thinking in their mind, they're thinking, yeah, all that's going on. But when Jesus rises to power and we get rid of all the people who are our enemies, then we'll be okay. But that's not how it was going to work. What Jesus was sharing with them, that there's a great deal of cost to being a disciple. And were they willing to pay the full price? When I was in seminary, there was a book that I read was life-changing for me, and it was The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a brilliant, brilliant young man from Germany. In the 1930s, he wrote his book, The Cost of Discipleship. And the big takeaway I got from that book was this: the difference between cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace, he says, is the grace we bestow upon ourselves to soothe the guilty conscience. Costly grace is the grace of a cross. In the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler was starting to become more and more popular, he started speaking out against him. And he had a radio address where he warned his people, he warned the religious leaders of his religious community not to follow the cult of the Führer, the cult of the leader. And in his address, it was cut off in mid-sentence because he was speaking against an incredible power. He came to the United States to finish his graduate work. But he found that the universities here were not meeting his intellectual and academic needs. But while he was in the United States, he did attend the African American churches. And he got to become very involved in the racial injustice in our nation during that time. And also he was highly, highly inspired by nonviolent resistance. Eventually he goes back to Germany. And then in the 40s, as things start to heat up again, he's been arrested. He's now having to run kind of as a fugitive. He came back to Union Theological Seminary to work and to teach. But it still wasn't right for him. And he writes this to Reinhold Niebuhr, a fellow countryman and another great theologian. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this: "I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people." And he went back. He was arrested in 1943 and put in prison, being charged with conspiring against Hitler. Later, he was put into a concentration camp. And in 1945, when the war was all but lost, out of spite, they took him and others that they made the same charges against and hanged them. He was 39 years old. He was totally dismayed that his people and the Protestant faith in Germany aligned themselves with Adolf Hitler. And there was only a small group who continued to, through nonviolent resistance, to resist. And it cost him his life. So, he gives us a powerful lesson on what it means to be a disciple. We can see how ego-centered ambition can destroy trust among those whom we work very closely with. And believe me, I'm not naive. I've lived long enough to see how ego-driven people claim that God is on their side. And when God is on their side, that gives them the freedom to do whatever they want to do to anyone they want to do it to. That's not an unusual thing to see. So how do we know a powerful religious leader is for God or against God? Jesus gives us the answer as he's now having to teach his disciples once again what it means to be a leader. I came across this interview with Jim Hunter by Tammy Simon from dailygood.org. And Jim Hunter is talking about what being a servant leader is. I'm going to share that with you now. A lot of times, people associate leadership with being the person who is in charge or somebody who's a good manager. And really, leadership is more synonymous with the word influence. Leadership is a skill that's learned and acquired ability. It's not something you're born with, but it's the ability to be able to inspire and influence people to action, the ability to get the fire going within somebody, where I want to do it now. So leadership is about inspiring and influencing people to action. The servant leader is not being a slave. By being a slave, a leader is not about doing what people want, but rather it's about doing what people need, and there's a huge difference. So what servant leaders are about is this: the business of identifying and meeting people's legitimate needs and seeking their greatest good so that they can grow. So the test of servant leadership is, do people leave you better than they found you? Do they leave things better than you found them? So am I going to grow as a result of being under your leadership? James and John, the sons of Zebedee, somehow got caught up in their own ego ambitions. And Jesus now once again has to teach them about who he is and what his movement is about. So one of the things that Jesus says in the passage, he says, the Gentile leaders and rulers lord themselves over others. Now, them's was fighting words, all right? His disciples weren't particularly flattered by being compared to Gentiles. But he reminds them the Gentile rulers lord themselves over others. And Jesus then says, not so with you. He says, first is the one who is a servant to all. First is the one who chooses to be a slave to all. In other words, our greatness is not defined in God's realm about how much power we can wield over others. It might look impressive to some, but in God's world and the world that Jesus teaches us, our power is in the way that we give, in the way that we serve. Our legacy is defined by what we have done for others and how we have made this world a better place. So at the end of the interview, I share this once again with you. So the test of servant leadership is, do people leave you better than they found you? Do they leave things better than you found them? So am I going to grow as a result of being under your leadership? So I ask you, Windermere Union Church, are we growing because we worship and work together? Are we growing and our lives are being changed for the better because of how we interact with each other and serve the world around us? Are we growing under each other's leadership? Are we becoming more enlightened and more empowered? Are we more empowered because of the way that we worship and work together? And do we recognize where this power comes from? All of us are tempted with our ego minds to rule the world to some degree, whether it's the whole planet, the universe, or maybe just our house. But Jesus teaches us as his disciples that if we want to experience leadership, then we must consciously choose to be a servant, consciously choose to nurture and empower one another, consciously choose to see what we can give rather than we can demand people give us. So the Windermere Union Church, we find ourselves at a crossroad. In February of 2020, we were on top of the world. Our membership was high. Our attendance was high. We're solid financially, and the incredible spirit of this place was just overwhelming. And after a year and a half of COVID, we find that it looks like we're starting all over again. What are we going to do? Are we going to use our egos and force people to come? Hey, I know a guy. Hey, we'll send them to their houses. Hey, you get your... I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. What are we going to do? Next year, our official board is in process of planning another gathering of our congregation to answer that question. Because we're not going to be Windermere Union Church of February 2020. That's gone. Now, who we are as a people in our spirit still remains very much the same. But who we're going to become now, we have to recreate. We have to decide all over again what our purpose is, how we're going to use the power that's within us to create a sanctuary, a safe place for all of God's children to worship and to learn and to grow. There have been consequences for not having in-person worship for a year and a half. Some of our friends cannot come because their immune systems are compromised and they still don't want to take the risk. Others in our congregation don't want to wear a mask while they're here. So we're caught in between those two groups. Some people over the last year and a half have found that not being here is okay and have found other things to do with their time on Sunday. And some are not going to be coming back for whatever reason. So we find ourselves at a crossroad. We find ourselves at a point in time where our formal leaders and our lay leaders need to start reconnecting to your energy and to your power. Not one from ego, but one from what? Spirit. We must continue to become even more conscious of how we are connected to God and to one another. And we've got to become extremely intentional as to how we're going to continue to work together. But for what? To what end? We cannot recreate the past. I wish we could, but we can't. But rather, we've been called to a more difficult task, to recreate the present and the future. It takes more energy. It takes more imagination. It takes more commitment. It requires a costly discipleship. Do we recognize where we get our power? Is our power from a source just within us that we will just make things happen because we are pushy enough and bold enough and presumptuous enough to make everybody do what we want them to do? At the Windermere Union Church, that will not work. I know that will not work. Even though we're a fraction of who we used to be, number-wise. But I am hopeful. I am confident that as we gather together as disciples, we're going to create something that's just as powerful and wonderful as what we had, maybe even more so. Who do we want to be, Windermere Union Church? Who do we want to be? Do we want to be confident? Do we want to be connected? Do we want to be engaged? Do we want to make it a part of our purpose to make sure that everyone we encounter in this place and the world around us are better off and more deeply connected to God than when we found each other? When we know who we want to be, then we can define what we need to do to become that in our church and the world around us, and the have will take care of itself. Why do I know this? Is because Jesus has been doing it for over 2,000 years. He knew who he was. He knew what he had to do, and the have has taken care of itself. We need leadership. And we need disciples. But we need disciples to live with costly grace. It's going to cost us. We're going to have to be immersed in it. We're going to have to drink from the cup to commit ourselves. To commit ourselves. To be a shining light, a beacon of hope, a house of hospitality, and to assure the skeptical and those who've been bruised by religion in particular that when they come through those doors, not only will they be welcomed, but they will be embraced and they will be accepted for who they are. We're not going to change who they are. We want them to help become the better version of who they are. We want to help them to become empowered so that they can truly fulfill everything that they have within them and their purpose on this planet. And as we empower one another, we become stronger. And as we become stronger, we can have a more powerful effect on the world around us because we know who we are. Our power does not come from ego and ambition, but rather from being a people of grace, from being a people of costly grace. Thus ends the lesson. Go with peace and purpose.